Hello and welcome to kind of a random video that I'm doing because I've been playing around a little bit with testing Kerbal inventory system. Now, aside from the winches, which is from Kerbal attachment system, I'm only using Kerbal inventory system for this video. And what I'm doing is actually building a rocket. And the reason I have Kerbal attachment system is simply for that winch, which will help me build this thing. And as you can see, just using a bunch of parts, I'm able to start actually constructing a real rocket with a whole bunch of science. Now, the design of this rocket is actually meant for min-miss, since it's designed to have a very low thrust-to-weight ratio. It's designed to kind of cart around min-miss and gather lots of science with an engineer, or not an engineer, but a scientist on board, since it does come with SAS, which is why there's a probe core. Now, to me this was more of a proof of concept thing that Kerbal inventory system can be used to make a stable rocket. And from what I found is it can. Now there are some couple weird things with the connections on some parts where they don't necessarily work entirely the way you might expect, and sometimes there's strange gaps in between. But for the most part, all the nodes actually connect very stable and can allow for the rocket to actually be built. Now, what you noticed there with the fuel tank why it flew off and exploded was I forgot to actually hold down the X modifier key that attaches the part, so I just dropped the part and it hit the ground and exploded. But again, this is quite incredible actually. Being able to, say, put a bunch of rocket parts in those two large containers on this rover, and then be able to just move the rover around and wherever you need to, build a small rocket or a small lander. Of course, I could do this with any other parts. I just used rather small parts because, like I said, it's a min-miss lander design. And also what you can do is if you do have Kerbal attachment system, which are these little nodes you see me putting on right now, what they can actually do is act as a fuel line. So even though you notice none of the fuel tanks are connected to the engine, and that the engine will not have any fuel in it, I can actually use those fuel lines to pump fuel from one end to the other, which is what actually allows me to pump fuel from the top tanks to the bottom tanks. However, I did run out of the pipe end ports, so I just grabbed some more from that other rover I drove over, and lowering or raising this back up so I can get under to the engine, I just start trying to attach them. Now, what you're witnessing with Kerbal attachment system is a known bug that I just forgot to take into account. When you use the winches and you leave physics range with them not docked to your vessel, they begin to act very strange and do strange things that kind of causes them to ignore physics and ignore any rules that are supposed to be set by them. So basically, if you're going to be using a winch in undocked mode and you leave the scene or you leave physics range, then before you do that, make sure you actually dock it. Otherwise, very bad things will start happening with that winch because it then becomes unpredictable. You're not sure if it's just going to not work or if it's still going to half work or really what's going on. And as you can see, it's just kind of dangling there. It still has some force on this small min-miss craft here. However, it's not connected to the right spot, so the force is kind of unpredictable. Now, if you notice, after I set up the fuel lines, you can see that this rocket actually works. Now, it doesn't have enough thrust-to-weight ratio to actually lift off on Kerbin, but with a 0.4 thrust-to-weight ratio, it does have more than enough to actually take off on min-miss. And what you're noticing there is if you drop small parts in Kerbal inventory system, which again is another known bug. When you drop very small parts, they actually explode for whatever reason, but the larger parts, like the fuel tanks, they don't explode, so they were fine to just let go. And this is me just attempting to roll this thing over, and then deciding, can I pull an active engine off a craft? And as it turns out, you can. And you can put it back on and it'll automatically start again, which I found kind of interesting. So I was a little discontent not having actually tested this thing on min-miss, and as you can see, we're just looking at the visual bug I was talking about where there's a gap between two parts. It seems as though the nodes connect a little bit out of distance, so that there's just a small visual gap, Visually, I believe that's the only issue with it, though if you drive it through the atmosphere, it might have an effect, but I'm not entirely sure. So, now that I just kind of showed the weird gap, it does actually fly, and I had noticed a small speck. So I'm just testing it landing, and it lands fine, and then I noticed that there's a screwdriver, or a power drill, from Kerbal Inventory System, which is the tool you give to engineers so that they can actually grab parts and reattach or detach them from other vessels. But anyhow, I have no idea how it got there, but I'm not too interested in it. I want to actually see how this thing holds up, with almost all conditions as variable. So all I'm going to do is take this thing into Minmus's orbit and bring it back, and it surprisingly goes very well. So I get into orbit, and I just start raising my periapsis, until of course it's a good distance away, and then while I'm there, I actually begin to burn to return to Kerbin, because I have plenty of delta V to do this, and as you can see, we're just going to move into Kerbin and try and land on it. Now, do know that this vessel doesn't have any parachutes, which is why things are exploding, or a heat shield. However, I just want to test these parts' connections, make sure the parts still adhere to physics, and make sure that they're not really being very strange. Such as, I could actually make vessels that I construct on the surface of the moon as return vessels, and then return my Kerbals. And as you can see, the vessel holds up for the most part. Now, it doesn't actually survive the crash too much since we didn't have parachutes, but if we had parachutes and a heat shield, then the vessel would have worked just fine. But that is the end of the rocket built entirely using Kerbal Inventory System. Anyhow, I thank you guys for watching. This is PTT GRW, signing out.